G'day everyone, we are up to number 2 in my top 20 albums countdown, and I've been looking forward to talking about this one, a very special record in my collection and I suspect a lot of other people's. It's not one of the usual suspects, it's not one of the biggest bands in the world. It is a band which I've always thought of as a short-lived but brilliantly blazing comet on the skyline of the rock music scene. And the band I'm talking about is At the Drive-In from the United States, from El Paso, Texas, in fact. And the album is their masterpiece from the year of 2000, Relationship of Command. If you haven't heard of these guys or this album before, I'm going to give you a full rundown on it. If you have, you'll know just where I'm coming from in terms of my enthusiasm for it, because this album is absolutely brilliant. It is very hard to describe, I find. What sort of band have At the Drive-In been? Post-hardcore is probably the most frequent description of them, but an incredible blend of influences and sounds. There's a real noisy, messy quality to their music and their lyrics, but somehow it all hangs together brilliantly, and most of all on this album, which was their third album and far and away their biggest hit. When I say short-lived comet, unfortunately they split up not long after this album was released, actually reformed a few years back and ended up putting out another album in 2017, which isn't bad, but certainly not to the same levels of this record. It has a very aggressive edge, but not in that typical hardcore manner. It has a lot of melody in it as well. It has a driving rhythm section. It has very emotive vocals from frontman Cedric Bixler Savala. And lyrically, at times, his lyrics are like a word salad, but in the same way as poetry, I think it allows you to sort of interpret the songs as you like, and I find that one of the great pleasures of listening to this album. The thing I love most about it is that it just, and I've used this phrase a bit during this series, it picks you up by the collar and shakes you around, and throws you around the room a bit, and then picks you up and throws you around again. And when you finish listening to it, you are physically as well as emotionally drained. It's frenetically energetic. Hard to describe really in adequate words just how frenetic this album is, and at times very discordant sound. But like I say, it comes together and it just never relents from the moment you start. The first track on this record is Arsenal. Starts with a very sort of ominous sounding drum roll, and then the guitars kick in, great bass guitar, and the lyrics. He is a great vocalist, Cedric. He just really, he can hit the high notes, he can sustain a scream, but always articulate at the same time. You don't have any trouble understanding the words. Sometimes you can have trouble understanding what these strings of words mean, but like I say, that's half the fun. I first heard this band with what would be the first single off this album, One Arm Scissor, which is the third track. That comes after Arsenal and Pattern Against User, another very catchy song. Most of these tracks could have been played on radio. Number 4 track, Sleepwalk Capsules. It's one of the best runs of opening 4 tracks on an album I can remember. It does slow down in parts, and when I talk about the emotiveness of it, one song in particular, Invalid Litter Department, which is quite slow in tempo, and a really meaningful song too, written about what were called the Juarez murders in Mexico, just across the border from El Paso, Texas. And this is a series of gruesome murders in the 1990s. We're talking about hundreds of young women and girls who were, beaten, bashed, murdered, and a lot of these crimes went unsolved, and there was a real reticence or lack of action from the authorities involved, and it became a real scandal. And these guys sing about it beautifully and very emotionally. Um, like I say though, that's a rare pause. One of the guests on this album was a big name indeed. Iggy Pop dropped by the studio. He was friends with the producer. He appears as backing vocalist on one of my favourite tracks, Rolodex Propaganda, and the track before that actually, which almost my favourite. It's called Enfilade, and it starts off with Iggy Pop delivering a ransom note over the phone to a woman who picks up the phone and says hello, and Iggy, in a very deep voice, but like clearly across the phone line, starts talking about. He calls her mother leopard. I have your cub. You must protect her, but that'll be expensive. 10,000 cola nuts wrapped in brown paper. Midnight behind the box. I'll be the hyena. You'll see. I've never forgotten that run of words, and it's a beautiful song as well. It's got a lovely little interlude with the accordion. Makes it sound like you're walking down the streets of Paris or somewhere. That's on the second side. After that, Quarantine, which is another slower track. You've got the sound of rainfall in the background, very atmospheric, that one. And then again, an argument for my favourite track, Cosmonaut, which is emotional. It's got guitars going left, right, and centre. It's got a great bass line, and again, that frenetic energy. It just, I can't remember ever listening to a record that's left me feeling as drained as this one does, but in a really good way. And you just put this on, and from start to finish, you're just totally, well, I have been anyway, every time I listen to it, totally entranced. And at the end of it, just thinking, wow, what a stunning statement this was. It's such a shame this band never really went on with it for various reasons. So I mentioned Cedric Bixler, the lead vocalist. Incredible to watch live too. When I talk about frenetic energy, he hurls himself around the stage. Omar Rodriguez Lopez is the lead guitarist. You've got Jim Ward on guitar, Paul Hinios, the bass player, and Tony Haya on the drums. Now, soon after this album, these two factions of the band split into two bands. Mars Volta was Cedric and Omar, and they were pretty big commercially, and Sparta was basically the other guys in the band. And both those bands have brought out some great stuff, well worth listening to. But again, I would argue not on the same scale as this. So it's a big call, #2 album of all time for a band that didn't really produce that much in terms of quantity. But some bands just have a definitive statement and never come close to recapturing that at any subsequent stage, or never got near it beforehand. I'd argue this is one of those cases, and as I guess unfortunate it is, as they were short-lived, this is an amazing legacy to have left the world of music, and it's got mass critical appeal. It's been nominated highly in a lot of lists of top albums of the 21st century, and this category and that category. It just stands up in every conceivable way. I never, ever, ever get sick of playing it. And no record leaves me feeling in such different fashions, happy, sad, energetic, disenchanted. I mean, it just taps into all those basic emotions, and it's just a wonderful listening experience. I don't think there's been a band that sounded even close to how these guys sounded, and that is an amazing legacy in itself, I think. Cannot talk enough about this album. It's a ripper. Whatever you do, if you haven't heard it, sit down and have a listen. It'll be well worth your time. Relationship of Command by At the Drive-In from 2000. That's the record. I'm going to be back very shortly with my #1.